Welcome everyone, both in person and online. Thank you for joining us for this lecture in our Delta on the Move lecture series. As the name kind of already says, this is this lecture series is part of our new project here at the Institute called Delta on the Move, which looks at the historical development of the Greater Bay Area, broadly speaking. And I'm today also joined here in person by the lead researcher on this project, Dr. John Wong, my colleague here at the Institute. And I should also say that this event is co-hosted with the Chinese Business History webinar. So today we're very happy to welcome to the Institute Professor Macabe Keliher from Southern Methodist University, where he is an associate professor. He received his PhD from Harvard University, and his first book, The Board of Rights and the Making of Qing China, was published to much acclaim and won several awards. And what he's going to talk to us about today, though, is a new project that he's working on Taiwan and Hong Kong economic relations. So we're very excited about that. His talk today is entitled Hong Kong Industry and the Taiwan Developmental State, the Case of Meyer Aluminum 1970 to 1990. Now, before I hand things over to Macabe, I should say that the format of the talk today is that Professor Keliher will first present, and then we'll have some time for question and answers. If you're in person here, you can just ask as usual. But if you're online, please post your questions in the Q&A button in Zoom, and I will then read them out during the Q&A period. And then Professor Keliher can get back to you. But I don't want to take up any more time, so okay, if you're ready, please feel free to get started.
All right. Well, thank you, Jocelyn, and thanks to John. I'm very pleased to be here. During these times, I've much enjoyed the webinar and the various talks that you've hosted. I'm very pleased to be able to be part of that and to join you here in person. I should say that the series that you put on, I found very valuable as I've been making this transition to become a business economic historian, especially one working on 20th century for somebody who's trained as a Qing historian and political history. I find these kinds of webinars very valuable to getting up to speed and learning the issues. And I'm pleased to be here in person in order to meet people and make these new connections. So my new projects, of which I've been working on over the past year or so, is on post World War II East Asian economic development, with a particular focus on Hong Kong, which I'll explain why I'll explain why in a moment. And I'm going to put that at the center of my talk today, which I think should be pertinent since we are in Hong Kong, and it is like the Hong Kong business series and Delta on the Move. So I begin with this graph of Taiwan and some other East Asian countries' economic development, which should be no surprise to us. We've seen before this very spectacular economic growth of Hong Kong. And the period that I'm interested in most is right about 1960, when it begins to climb and begins to take economic growth begins to take off exponentially. And it's during this period, so the 60s, 70s, and then through the 80s, which is the focus of my research, focus on this talk today, and particularly in industrial manufacturing, of which is going on at this time. So many of you are probably aware Hong Kong is going through this economic transition of moving from an entropole, this area was dealing mainly in trade, and the industry is beginning to pick up in post-World War II. And it's in 1960s and 70s that we begin to see industrial diversification, which really begins to accelerate Hong Kong's economy during this time. A few statistics on the importance of industry in this time in order to emphasize its contribution to Hong Kong's economic growth. So a third of GDP, it's employing over half of the workforce, and accounting for over 90% of the exports. Again, it's to emphasize the importance of industrial manufacturing during this period. again, this is not too much of a surprise, especially what we know is going on in the region during this time. All of East Asia is growing quite rapidly. I mean, beginning with Japan, which is not on this graph, but Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, and Hong Kong is very much part of that. All these regional economies are growing exponentially. Why? Well, this has been the subject, of course, of much research. And the focus that scholars have taken is on what is termed the developmental state. The reason why these regional economies, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan especially, is because of state intervention, of which is helping these economies industrialize and to catch up with the already developed world. So very, very briefly on the developmental state. What is it? States actively governing the economy and market rather than, say, the converse, which might be a free market where the state's not playing any role in letting markets work. There are a couple of ways this is playing out: state-directed lending, robust industrial policies, and national industries, which I'll talk a bit about today in Taiwan, as well as promoting technological development. Now, the problem with Hong Kong is, as I just said, that very strong economic growth and rapid industrialization, much like its counterparts in the region, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And yet there is no developmental state. So the state is not playing the same role that we see it playing in the other regional economies. And yet not only it's growing, but if you look at this graph in the bottom left-hand corner here, is productivity growth. And we see that Hong Kong, which is the blue line there, is some of the most robust productivity growth and efficiency in the region, just behind Japan. So how to explain Hong Kong? If the focus of research on East Asian economic growth has been on state and state intervention, it's not happening in Hong Kong. How is Hong Kong doing it? There's been a number of explanations of this. I'm going to go quickly through these in the interest of time. If you're interested, we can get more into it in Q&A. There's essentially what I find three explanations for Hong Kong and Hong Kong industrialization and economic growth during this period. The first, free market, and this is everything from like your Milton Friedman, which is saying that the state is playing absolutely no role, and it's all free market and laissez-faire economy, which is a position no one really adheres to today unless you're like the Cato Institute. But a more credible explanation or research on this has been on Hong Kong entrepreneurship. The proximity to China, so this is both through immigration, especially very early on after the Civil War in China, that you had a lot of industrialists coming to Taiwan, bringing their capital and know-how, coming to Hong Kong, bringing their capital and know-how to Hong Kong, encouraging growth, but as well as this proximity to China, which gives Hong Kong access to cheap resources, water and food, mainly. And then the third explanation is selected state intervention. So not the same kind of robust developmental states that we see in the other East Asian economies, but a more limited role, but which is still helping Hong Kong industrialize, keeping housing prices low, getting low food in, both from China as well as importing, putting caps on rice prices, land provisions, and maintaining low inflation. In a sense, so all these explanations are neoclassical, or they have neoclassical roots, that they're focusing on the comparative advantage of low-cost production. Essentially, that they're attempting to explain Hong Kong, how is it able to have low-cost labor and have low-cost production and be competitive in global markets. Their focus is, and the analysis is largely on factor accumulation, looking at labor and capital inputs. And in this analysis, the technology and skill is exogenous. So there is no internal technological development or skill development, as we might see happening in other states, which explanation usually goes is a consequence of state intervention in order to train workers or develop various technologies. For Hong Kong, that this is all coming, this is all external. Now, the problem with this explanation is that it conflates growth with development, and what I see sort of as the classical problem that both historians and scholars usually have when looking at China of talking about Smithian growth, of seeing that if the economy is growing, therefore it is necessarily developing. But as I'll talk about a little bit later, that increase in production doesn't mean increase in productivity. So what all these studies assume is that existing technological capacity. And all that's needed to happen is to lower wage costs in order to make Hong Kong more competitive on the produced products, which are more competitive on international markets. So it's assuming that technology is already existing or it's coming in from the outside. As I see it, however, and we need to explain how firms acquired and used greater manufacturing capacities. So that's the puzzle that I set up here. Now, the argument that I'm going to be making today in order to answer this question is that Hong Kong firms at this period, really beginning in the late 60s and accelerating into the 70s and 80s, needed more advanced machinery and manufacturing technology. They're increasing productivity, increasing their efficiency. They are diversifying. And in order to do that they needed not just cheap labor. And in fact, sometimes cheap labor was not necessary at all, but what they needed was greater technology. Unlike Japan, South Korea, or Taiwan, that the state was not helping in this. The state was not providing any type of benefits or development which would help them acquire this technology. And therefore, firms turned to a regional development state. And in this case, what I'll be talking about today is they turned to Taiwan. And the Taiwan state-owned industries supplied Hong Kong firms with this necessary technology for diversification and increased productivity. Now, I'm going to be making my argument based on work that I've done in Taiwan, the Guojia Dangguan, the National Archive Administration. So the bulk of the research that I've done to date is from this archive in Taiwan. The past couple of days, I've been here at the Hong Kong Public Records Office, and I'll supplement some of the findings and supplement my talk today with some of the findings that I found. But it's largely based on records I found in the National Archive Administration. My talk will proceed in three parts. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about Hong Kong firms, what they're doing in diversification, and particularly what they need. I hope what's going to come out of that brief discussion is the importance of the micro perspective, of shifting the view from, say, the macro economy to the micro economy and looking at Hong Kong firms. And in doing that gives us a different perspective of what is going on in Hong Kong's economy and I hope help further explain Hong Kong's economic growth. The second part of the talk is going to ask why Taiwan and look closely at Taiwan Machine Manufacturing Corporation and how Hong Kong firms were reaching out to it and how it was working in order to meet the needs of Hong Kong firms. And then I'm going to get into the specific case of Meyer Aluminum. So looking in depth at the development of Meyer Aluminum Limited and the advanced machine and production capacities that it needed. So I'm going to look closely at aluminum rolling, what aluminum rolling consisted of, and why it necessitated greater production technologies. I prepared quite a lot of slides today. I think more than 45 minutes worth of slides. So I'm going to, if I talk, I usually take about like 2 or 3 minutes per slide in my talks, and I think I have over 30 slides. So I'm going to move through the slides rather quickly and let the slides do some of the work, and we can come back to various points that I gloss over during Q&A if you're interested in. So let's dive into it. First, Hong Kong firms. Now, particularly here, I want to start with this question of productivity. So initially, especially in the 1950s, Hong Kong's mainly the majority of Hong Kong industrial production is in textiles. Even once into the 1960s, that industrialists and various officials began to recognize, for various problems, again we can get into in the Q&A, that Hong Kong needed to transition out of this. That low-cost labor was not the way forward. The Hong Kong industry had to develop, and Hong Kong had to develop greater productive capacities. So in 1963, that the governor formed this working committee on productivity, and in 64 they put out a report where they the secretary, the lead guy of this committee, made this distinction between production and productivity. It says production, yeah, you can produce more just by working harder, but that's not what we want to do. We want to increase productivity, which means using more efficiently and more effectively both human and material resources, upgrading skills as well as upgrading the capacities in order to produce more outputs with less inputs. In 67, they officially established this productivity council, and it began putting out annual reports. In 72, again, it's addressing this problem of Hong Kong's industrial future and the need in order to create, in order to raise productivity. And here they're effectively saying that we need to, in order for the economy to grow, in order to make this transition in Hong Kong industry, then we need to figure out ways to do more with less. We need to figure out how to become more efficient with our to produce more outputs with less inputs, and that was sort of the aims of this productivity council in aiding Hong Kong firms to increase their productivity. And part of this was this diversification away from labor-intensive industries such as textiles. So initially, Hong Kong's the majority of its industry and exports is in textiles. As it begins to diversify, that there's four key industries that it begins moving into. So at the top is clothing and garments. So rather than just producing textiles and shipping them somewhere else to be able to turn into end products, Hong Kong begins doing this itself. Electronics is another area. And really, it's electronics and textiles, which remain two of the key industries for Hong Kong's for Hong Kong exports. Closely behind these, though, are plastics. It's kind of a morbid picture of these plastic doll heads, right? Plastic flowers is another one. I couldn't find a good picture of plastic flowers, so you get the doll heads. And metal manufacturing. And this is everything from the production of metals, such as aluminum, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, that you can then mold into other things, as well as the end product of what is molded. Cutlery, knives and forks and things, becomes a big thing in Hong Kong production as well in this diversification. So as Hong Kong firms begin to attempt to increase their productivity, as they're diversifying in different industries, that they're not able to do this out of thin air. As much as officials and CEOs like to talk about Hong Kong pulling itself by its bootstraps that it made, that Hong Kong people made themselves, that's not what actually happened. In order to complete these transitions, that they needed better production capacity. They needed greater technology. And the question was, where are they going to get that from? How are they going to train people in using this technology and creating greater efficiency in their factories? So what I found in the Hong Kong archive are hundreds of letters from Hong Kong firms to Taiwan requesting things. Requesting Taiwan supply them with both machinery and know-how in order to diversify into other areas and increase their production capacity. I've categorized these requests into four types. Again, I'll move through these rather quickly. So the first is metal fabrication, which I'm going to talk about more later. And this included rolling mills as well as metal cutting. So the rolling mills in order to create plates, sort of the raw materials needed to mold into other things, as well as ways in order to cut and shape various metals. So these large machines, like you see in such a picture. The second category is food production, especially sugar in sugar mills. They're ordering whole sugar mills for the production of turning the cane into granulated white sugar. But there are also requests for canning, both the macote, the tin plate needed for the canning, as well as machines in order to make the can and to put the food into the can. The third category of requests is in construction. And these are things like welding machines, as well as cement machines, in order to aid in the construction boom, which is happening throughout the 70s and 80s. And the fourth category is in shipbuilding. Now, this includes both the hull, although a little less so, because there were a number of Hong Kong companies that were doing the hulls, but more so the engines and parts for the engines, especially propellers, that Hong Kong firms were turning to Taiwan in order to supply with. Now, the thing to emphasize is that in all these requests, it's largely for the machinery and for a more advanced technology than what Hong Kong firms had access to, or what was being able to be supplied to them domestically from Hong Kong. All right, now part two. Here, Taiwan and Taiwan Machinery Manufacturing Corporation. So the question here is, Hong Kong firms are writing to Taiwan. Now, first, I want to look at how that happened. How are they reaching out to them? So they were doing so in one of three ways. From this cachet of letters from these Hong Kong firms, they would write to sort of the equivalent of Hong Kong Trade Development Council, the China External Trade Development Council, which was Taiwan's Trade Development Council, is now known as TAITRA, the Taiwan Trade Development Council. They would write directly to them. They would say the requests: I need a sugar mill. Can you set me up with a manufacturer to make a sugar mill for me? They might write directly to the Ministry of Economic Affairs in Taiwan, making this request. But the majority of letters were going directly to Taiwan Machine Manufacturing Corporation, Taiji Gongsi, in Taiwan, which is a state-run company. And I'll talk more about them next. And more, they would write directly to any one of these, but mostly when they're writing to Taiji Gongsi, they'd be very specific in saying what they need from TMMC and asking if TMMC could provide this for them. Now, why Taiwan and why, and especially why Taiji Gongsi? The short answer is because it had the capacity. They did a little bit of advertising in Hong Kong. I won't get too much into that right now. We can talk about that in Q&A if you want. But I want to emphasize here is the capabilities of Taiji Gongsi. So Taiji Gongsi was formed in 1948 when the communists, when the communists drove the KMT to Taiwan. The KMT took over, and then eventually that they were completely driven out of China. And in doing so, they took over all the Japanese assets on Taiwan. There were five companies. There were five Japanese companies on Taiwan engaged in machinery repair, sugar manufacturing, and then shipbuilding operations. There were two sugar companies and two shipbuilding operations. And the KMT put all these into one company and called it Taiji Gongsi. it came directly under the Ministry of Economic Affairs, and it was to serve the developmental goals of the Taiwan state. And it would be tasked with often rather random things and have to figure out how to do so. So, for example, in the 1950s, Taiwan was importing a lot of bicycles as everyone who'd been driven out of mainland China was coming to Taiwan, and they needed transportation. So they're riding bikes, and Taiwan was importing a lot of bicycles. And so Taiji Gongsa got the directive to begin manufacturing bicycles, which it did for a number of years before then handing off to Taiwan's to smaller firms in Taiwan. And that was sort of its modus operandi. So, how Taiji Gongsa was operating, they would develop a technology, develop a capacity, the tools, for example, to make a bicycle frame, and then sell them at very low prices to local Taiwan firms to get then local Taiwan firms to begin to take over these industries. Later on, in the 70s, when Taiwan leaves the UN and it begins losing diplomatic allies, that Taiji Gongsa then is tasked in helping keep diplomatic allies by working with them on the ground to develop various industries and providing tools, especially these African and South American countries, where it begins helping them develop sugar mills is a big thing. But in the beginning in the late 50s and 60s, that Taiji Gongsa gets a bunch of US aid to begin developing its own capacity to manufacture machine tools and diesel engines, and so it develops an expertise in these large machine manufacturing tools to create rolling mills and to create large diesel engines. So it develops this capacity, and it begins to have a reputation for doing so throughout the region. Hong Kong firms come to know of Taiji Gongsa, and they begin to write letters saying, "We need a rolling mill, we need a sugar mill. Can you supply this for us?" And it seems that there's some advertisement, and there's some trade missions by Taiwan to Hong Kong in order to promote this, but by and large, it seems word of mouth, because I can see these requests accelerating through the 70s. That is to say, within the letters themselves from Hong Kong firms are saying, "We heard about you from this other firm. Can you also provide such machines for us?" So my emphasis here, answering the question, why are Hong Kong firms turning to Taiwan? It's by dint of reputation, as well as this capacity of this state-owned enterprise, Taiwan Machine Manufacturing Corporation. I want to look closely at Meyer Aluminum. So Meyer Aluminum was a Hong Kong firm, which developed a very close working relationship with Taiji Gongsa. And in doing so, it wasn't just purchasing machinery from Taiji Gongsa, but also working with it to service that machinery, to learn about the machinery, how to run it efficiently, as well as to train Meyer Aluminum's engineers in running this. So it's both the physical and human capital development. So first, Meyer Aluminum. Meyer Aluminum was formed in 1951 in dealing initially in metal finished goods for export. The founder of this came to Hong Kong in 1947 as a refugee from the communists, rather poor, an uneducated man, Chung, who he only had a secondary school education, didn't have much money, but he saw something happening in metal finished goods and was able to establish a very sort of small operations, making little things like ashtrays and flashlights and other little things, just stamping the aluminum. as there was a push for productivity and diversification that Meyer sees that it wants to develop its own rolling mill to produce its own aluminum, where previously that it would purchase the raw aluminum materials and then make its utensils or flashlights or whatever it was making. I think what's going on from looking recently at materials I found here in Hong Kong is that the Hong Kong Productivity Council leads a mission of aluminum manufacturers that is making manufacturers of aluminum products to Japan to visit Japanese companies which see this vertical integration, and they come back and some of them end up setting up mills. And Meyer seems to be one of them. In any case, in the late 1960s, then Meyer sees that it wants to get into metal fabrication and producing its own raw material of the aluminum in order to, which it then would use in order to produce the finished good. So it's beginning to create vertical integration with this. In 1970, it buys its first machines from Taiwan, from TSMC. Metal, the rolling mill, the machines in order to produce the aluminum in this. And it becomes very, very successful. It goes on to establish a number of mills, and Meyer is one of the leading aluminum manufacturers of finished goods as well as in the raw materials. So I want to talk about the sophistication of aluminum rolling and why Meyer had to turn to Taiwan in order to get this machinery. Why this was such a big step in order to increasing productivity and efficiency, and why it necessitated looking elsewhere in order to acquire this technology and to run this. So I'm going to take you on a little tour of aluminum rolling and what this means. So in short, so in brief, what happens is moving from the raw aluminum ingot, which is this picture of it here. I'll skip the whole foreground of what is aluminum isn't a raw material. What comes on the ground, it comes with boxum, and then you have to induce it with electricity and strip it of various ferrous metals in order to create the raw aluminum and the ingot. But usually what happens is the company will buy the raw ingot, mainly from Australia during this time and today. And then from this ingot, to create the billet. So melt down the ingot in the furnace and pour it in a mold to create the billet, these large aluminum slabs, which are about, I don't know, maybe 3 meters high, 2 or 3 meters high by a meter wide, which then can be easily manipulated into the finished product, which is an aluminum foil, which will be anywhere from I don't know, maybe a tenth of an inch to the third of the width of a human hair, depending on what the finished product is needed for. But so there's this process of turning the ingot into the slab, and then pressing the slab in order to thin it to become the aluminum foil. On the surface, it's very simple. You just take the slab and you roll it through large rollers in order to flatten it. And you do that a number of times, and it flattens it out. Now, the concept again is fairly simple. That you have rollers. You heat up the slab, pass the slab through the rollers, and as it passes through the rollers, that it deforms the slab and presses it thinner. Humans began doing this in the 16th century, and it was a fairly initially it's a fairly simple process, as you see from this still primitive rolling mill here. So you have the large rollers, and two guys will just pass the sheet back and forth until it reaches the required thinness. But in the 20th century, and especially in the 1960s, things began to get automated. and it becomes more complex in order to both press the final product much thinner, as well as to increase the efficiency and the productivity of this. And this is a rough schemata of what an aluminum mill would look like in the 60s, and they haven't changed that much since then. But at the time, this was a big innovation of moving from something like this in say the 19th century into further and further refinement. So by the 1960s and 70s, that they became fairly complex operations. I have broken this down into 3 key steps. So the first is a slab preparation, which roughly corresponds to this first part here. The second is the strip rolling, which corresponds to this middle part. And the third is the finishing, both coiling as well as slitting and smoothing. Now, I'm going to lead you through each of these processes so you get a sense of what is going on. So first, the slab preparation. This begins with a preheating furnace of heating up the slab or the billet. So this assumes that the ingot is already melted down into and put into the mold of this slab. This will usually happen. They'll do this all at once, and then they'll stack the slabs in some area, waiting for further processing. But of course, the slabs will cool down by then, and then you need to heat it up in order to be able to pass it through the rollers and press it thin. This is for hot rolling. Cold rolling is a different, slightly different operation. You won't have to heat it up, of course. But so there's this preheating furnace, and the preheating furnaces need to be set to very specific temperatures in order to ensure that the slab gets to the proper temperature in preparation for rolling. And so we see from Meyer the development of a knowledge of what that temperature is, what it needs, how it's going to reach that temperature with this furnace, and how to develop this, and in close communication with Taiji Gongsa, who has developed this both the technology to produce the furnace as well as the understanding about these things, of working with Taiji Gongsa in order to understand this and then to install and develop the particular furnace for its needs. I should emphasize here that what Taiji Gongsa is doing is all OEM, that there is no just like a standard furnace or a standard mill, which you would order from a catalog, that everything is done to specification. And so that you see in these correspondences a discussion about what those specifications are and how it will work in the factory. So in the slab preparation, the first part is preheating furnace. The second is a scalping machine. After the slab is heated up in the furnace, it's sent to the scalping machine, which removes any impurities. So it's essentially large blades of which will go over the top and the sides of it in order to remove the impurities, which will be picked up, such as carbonization in the preheating furnace. Now, the second stage of this is a strip rolling, and this is when the slab begins to be flattened. So first, we'll go through a roughing mill. Now, the roughing mill molds the slab to the proper width, and it gives it a first pass of flattening in preparation for the proper rolling, which is the finishing mill. Now, the finishing mill can be anywhere from one mill, say one of these of what you see in the picture, but most common by this time in the 70s was to have seven of them. So each pass through, it'll get thinner and thinner. So rather than having the two guys there, having to pass it back and forth continuously through one mill, that the slab would go through 7 different mills, and in each pass, it would get thinner and thinner, pressing it to the desired width. And so in total, the thing might be called the finishing mill, of which the slab would then pass through in each of these. But for someone like Meyer, who would say they would need to purchase seven entire mills here for the slab to pass through. It seems kind of like a black box. These things are actually quite complicated. There were different kinds of arrangements of the rollers this would pass through. Most common by this time was C, which is known as a 4-high mill, where there would be 4 rollers. So the slab passes through the very middle of it there, but you have these backup rollers, which are stabilizing rollers, which reduce the bend of the work rollers here. So if you have a 2-high mill like this, which is the most simplest mill, and again, like we see with the primitive mill, of 2 people just passing it through, there's a tendency of the work rolls then to bend and contort, which will decrease the uniformity of the slab as it's going through. And so there are these various different kinds of variations depending on what you're doing, but the most common is C, and this is what we see Meyer ordering from TMMC, the 4-high mill here. Which brings us then to the third process of the rolling of the aluminum, which is the finishing it. So after it comes out of the rolling mill, reaches the desired width, or the desired thickness or thinness, it's passed to the leveling machine. Because after it's coming off of the mill, that the sheet itself gets slightly warped, as you can kind of see here in this picture, as it's going through a leveling mill. And what the mill does is, again, a number of rollers, usually around 16, which are not as taut as the rolling mill, in order to gently level out the sheet and remove any deformities. Remove any deformities from it. After the finishing, it goes on to the slitting machine. And the slitting machine will cut the aluminum to the desired desired width. If you're going to use the aluminum for, I don't know, to make a spoon or something, you don't need this giant roll. You just need a small square of it, and this is what the slitting machine will do: is create this the smaller width of this for use in the end product. So these are the 3 stages, but at each that there is another very complex. I want to emphasize for each of these 3 stages, these are very complex machines of technology that needed to be developed. Taiji Gongsu was able to do so with U.S. loans in the 1960s, and so parts from U.S. loans and part from Taiwan government loans as well, and then of course to disseminate this to Hong Kong. Another very complex tool which is needed is this, which is a coiler. You have the slab, which is pressed thinner and thinner. So you see it's from a slab which is a couple inches thick initially, and as it gets pressed thinner and thinner, that it's moving from this 3-meter high slab to one of which can reach up to over 40 kilometers in length. And of course, there's nowhere to put that, so you got to coil it up. So you need somewhat of a complex machine in order to coil this, because you need to keep the proper tension. And as the roll gets bigger and bigger, that you need to increase the speed of which it rolls in order to ensure that the tension remains constant and that you have a uniform roll, and that this metal of which you just rolled thin doesn't get deformed. And once you roll it up, the thing is very heavy, so you need a coil car in order to transport it around, because you can't just pick these things up. So again, another very sophisticated machine of which is necessary for all this. Now, the end product looks something like this: these giant rolls of aluminum, then of which are used in order to make end products, such as your saucepans or your frying pans for Meyer. And today, in Meyer's the second largest manufacturer of these aluminum cookware products today. of which it produces out of its own aluminum rolling. So again, here, what I want to emphasize is that this is sophistication of this technology, of which is developed then by Taiji Gongsa, transferred to Meyer aluminum, as well as an instruction on how to use this. So let me offer now some preliminary conclusions of this study. So foremost, on Hong Kong, what I think this study can do is help answer the question of this graph, which again is the productivity of Hong Kong during this time. So it helps explain Hong Kong's productive capacity and how Hong Kong firms in their diversification are able to acquire necessary technology in order to create new kinds of products and to do so quite efficiently and continue the economic growth. Hong Kong's this development relies on Taiwan, and these firms are first turning to Taiwan to diversify and to secure the technology. But I want to emphasize here that they're doing so not simply importing technology. They're not just going to Taiwan, ordering a machine out of the catalog, and then flipping the switch and watching it produce something more effectively than what two guys rolling passing the aluminum back and forth at the mill did. No, what was also going on here was that Hong Kong was developing human capital. So there was skill upgrading as well in this. And this is seen through the communications between Taiji Gongsa and a company like Meyer, but also other firms that Taiji Gongsa was working with. Now, the second preliminary conclusion here, more broadly about the developmental state. What this begins to point, so much of the research on developmental state and East Asian economies is largely domestic or national stories. We have good studies about Japan, have good studies about Korea, have good studies about Taiwan, showing showing state intervention in guiding the economy and how the state helped quickly industrialize these economies. But these are largely national stories by developing industrial policies, by manipulating tax incentives, by creating import substitution and whatnot, that they help spur a national growth. But what we see here from this is that there's more to the story than that there's a network, that there's a regional network in place of which is helping firms develop. And so I think this goes helping then not just explain Hong Kong, but then also helping explain what's going on in Taiwan, because a company like Taiji Gongsa is not just selling products to Hong Kong in order to profit here, but it's also using this kind of network in order to further develop its own expertise, which then it uses for its own national development. And what this does, I think, is it shifts the focus from the state, from looking at certain policies by a state, to the firm, and show that growth here is less economic engineering and more the development of strategic opportunities. So this is to say that it isn't just some policies that we can impose from the top down, and therefore you have economic growth. And this is particularly problematic, of course, as we've seen we've seen this East Asian developmental state model, Latin American countries attempting to apply this model and failing to do so, thus thinking that perhaps there's something wrong with this developmental state model. But I think what I'm saying here is that our attention has been slightly off. And then if we look at the firm, that we see that there's certain condition, there's a certain context which is being set up. The state involved in setting up that context to a degree, and firms then finding ways in order to survive and succeed within that context, and creating out new types of networks and pathways in order to do so. So I'll end there. We'll get more into it during the Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, thank you so much for the wonderful talk. As I said, we have now some time for Q&A. If you're online, please submit your questions through the Q&A button in Zoom. If you're here, please just, as usual, ask a question and then we can start with the discussion. So, do we have anyone who wants to start?
Before we begin, I have one request. So I would really like to interview Meyer. I would like to understand more about Meyer, but I can find out very little about this company except what I know from the Taiwan side and from what it comes in its letters to Taiwan. I've not been able to find any records of that from the Hong Kong side, and I've reached out to Meyer, which still exists today, but have not received any reply. If anyone has ideas, if anyone knows anything about Meyer, that's fantastic. But I'm thinking, like, if anybody has ideas about how to contact this company and get an interview with them, or get access to their company archives or something, that would be fantastic.
So I love the micro history and seeing the letters, but I had sort of 3.5 comments came to mind. The first one, as a lawyer, right, I see this and I see intellectual property, right? And so I wonder, is that part of any of the conversation at all, right? That these are patented technologies, or that there's any sort of concern about that. And I realize the question maybe no, because of the next question, which is, obviously the US is involved indirectly in particular geopolitical policy, right? They want Taiwan to be doing various things, and part of the US's policy, and this in South Korea and other places, was relaxing IP restrictions and allowing technology transfer to happen more easily. So in that relation, you sort of see the US there, but is there any other geopolitical actors involved? Is the UK just sort of out to lunch? There's no sort of networks, there's no transnational sort of resources there for Hong Kong companies to look out to. So they're sort of getting this all indirectly from the US through Taiwan. And then the third one related to that is that the managerial class, right? Is there any type of transnational relationship? These letters are in English, right? Going back and forth. Are these people going there? Is there a similar place where people are going to school for engineering or business? Is there any sort of thing that links people together, right, in a larger sort of transnational context? And the 0.5 one, 0.5 is just if you want to get into it, is so similarly we have these trajectories of increasing productivity, its relationship to wages, right, and the ability of the state to intervene to reduce, right, wages from increasing, right, as part of the developmental state story. So is there anything going on there that you could see, as far as how is the relationship, as we continue to discuss it, between productivity and wages? And is there any labor side to the story at all that emerges sort of transnationally, given the fact that this is a hotbed of labor politics in the region, right, at the same time?
Say more though about what you mean by these transnational connections, because what I see going on both from the documents and sort of and more in the story that I'm going to tell is less of a larger transnational story, but more of sort of these regional networks of which are being created. But these are business networks between the firms themselves, which is taking place in terms of technology transfer as well as learning by doing, these kinds of transfers happening, but less so of I don't know a larger geopolitical development happening.
You mentioned several times U.S. aid to Taiwan.
Yes.
Right? We've got foreign advisors from the U.S. and all over the place, advisors and others, right? And they're very interested, right, in promoting Taiwan doing these sorts of things, right, building these types of relationships. You mentioned loans, right? So there's a high level of U.S. involvement in Taiwanese economic development at this time. And that's a very particular intentional strategy. On the Hong Kong side, so is the UK's are out to lunch when it comes to this? There's nothing sort of parallel. Is there any discussion, right, that there are these larger actors and sort of context when people are doing these transfers? At some levels, as a lawyer, they have to have some sort of conversation about where the IP is coming from, or they just are in a context where they don't have to be concerned about these things because these things aren't being enforced in this context. And the managerial class thing is where people are going to school, right? If you're an engineer, where are you learning or getting your engineering degrees, right? assume that's a transnational story. It's not all local universities. Obviously, same thing for like business education, economics education. Like who's running the companies and where are they getting their education? It seems to be another part of the story that can't purely be just regional.
Yeah. So I don't know what's going on with Britain in this, and its concern. It seems rather occupied with the handover and its relations with China at this time. And so from what I've seen is that U.S. concern with Hong Kong and with Taiwan and much of East Asia, of course, is with communism and making sure it doesn't go anti-communist. And so it wants to support Britain in the sense of ensuring that Hong Kong doesn't become communist in any capacity. So before the handover or whatever, Britain's going to negotiate something else besides the handover within 30 years off from this time. But U.S. interest here in the region is somewhat contradictory. So on the one hand, that they're very concerned politically, and so they want to support the economic development. And this comes up very clearly in the Kennedy administration, where they say, in order to thwart, very clearly in the National Security Council, they say, in order to thwart communism, we need to develop the economy of these places. Even after the aid to Taiwan ends, that they create the Sino-US Fund in order to ensure that Taiwan continues to have access to U.S. aid in order to help develop these projects. So something like TMMC, after U.S. aid ends in 67, that it puts in this big application in order to develop diesel engines as well as training for engineers to work on these machines, which it gets. So it gets this, puts in this application for U.S. funding, which is also then bolstered by the Taiwan government in order to do these things. The U.S. is also concerned in Taiwan concerned with Hong Kong, that it's especially in the Kennedy and Johnson administration, that they want to see Hong Kong continuing to develop economically. I think the interesting question here, which I would like to, which I need to pursue more, is are there discussions of where the U.S. is telling Taiwan to help promote Hong Kong industry, that the use of the state-run is the U.S. going to Taiwan government then using the state-run industry in order to promote Hong Kong industry? I don't know yet. But so you have this side of where, yes, U.S. promotion of economic development in the region, but at the same time, the U.S. is also very concerned about its markets. And so during the Kennedy administration, that they articulate internally the need in order, the desire to see Hong Kong's economy diversify because its products, its textiles are threatening U.S. manufacturers. So there's both this desire in order to promote economic development in the region, but at the same time, there's also the feeling of a threat and how to counter that. But I think we've seen this story play out in Korea and Japan before as well, and I think you can see it being played out in this context in this context as well. I haven't seen anything about IP issues though, and I know. I mean, I could speculate why. I think because this isn't it's not super advanced technology in electronics or semiconductors or something, that it's the development of machinery in order to roll metals, and that this is developed by it's developed internally by a Taiwan company. And then this Taiwan company working with Hong Kong firms in order to develop the capacity of what they need. but yes, okay. So then this is a good question though. But so then are there particular patents for the configuration of rollers or something like this? I don't know. And this hasn't come up in the materials that I've seen either. Yeah. So I'm not quite sure what else to say about this, except that it hasn't come up in any of the discussions or materials that I've seen. I don't know. I might ask you then, as a lawyer, about IP laws and when these develop and when it becomes a big deal. I don't know. Maybe we can talk about this later. Now the managerial class and the engineers of this. So the chief engineer of Meyer was trained in the U.S. in Oregon, and he ends up taking over the company in the end. Now, there's a question then about the other engineers in the company of where they're trained. It seems a number of them are being poached from Taiwan directly, and then where are these Taiwan engineers being trained? I'm not sure. It could be in the U.S., but as Hong Kong is looking for more, as Hong Kong firms are looking for greater capacities and skills, that they're turning to other places in the region, and Taiwan, both culturally and language-wise, would be a good place for that. And so, a number of engineers they're soliciting engineers from Taiwan to go over. But then the production, the Hong Kong Production Center also begins training people. They set up some technical colleges for this as well. But these connections that I think the point of connections which you're raising then I think might be from there of drawing Taiwan engineers to Hong Kong, as well then as the U.S. education side of this. Yeah, and then wages of this I haven't seen entered into into this. I'm not quite sure where to go with that question about wages on the matter. I mean, it's more of that it becomes less of a concern because a lot of this becomes automated, and so it's not a question of cheap labor. It's a question of skilled labor and ensuring that people know the machines and are able to operate them properly. I mean, one thing in their mission to Japan that they notice, that they take note of how well paid the workforce is in the rolling mills in Japan. So then it's a question: do they try to duplicate this as well in their own in their mills at home? I don't know. I don't have the materials in order to answer that.
Do you have any other questions?
Well, thanks for educating us about aluminum and the connection to Hong Kong. When we're talking about it, this is very true. And one of the projects I work on in the classical design and technology, the metalwork section, is to somehow cut out a piece of the aluminum and making it a chain. So I guess it brings back a lot of memories. And of course, we've all used Meyer products, the pots and pans, and never were connected to Hong Kong. So thanks for the education on that. I was actually looking at some of the information about founders and people involved. My question is probably more about the history side of things, the business side of things and the history classes that they took together. You told us a lot about the whole aluminum manufacturing process, and a key factor to it, the supplier, being the supplier technology in TMMC. We started talking about it actually before the talk when we're having coffee. I wonder if we can explore a little bit more of the food chain. Of course, especially as we talk about the end market. Well, what exactly are we rolling these coils of aluminum for? You indicated some of the uses like bikes, but Hong Kong is not a big producer of bikes, and my speculation of coffee was probably construction, because a lot of windows and gates or whatnot, and there was a big building cycle in Hong Kong at that moment. So I wonder if that actually plays to the various waves and crests of the Four Little Dragons, and not just in the economy, but also the whole building cycle. that they were going through, because there's not a whole lot of reason for us to manufacture those coils here in Hong Kong. You know, the raw material is not here, unless you have a big domestic need for these materials. Why even build that in Hong Kong? So that's my question. And the other one is, I find it quite interesting that you brought up shipbuilding, which was big in Hong Kong, of course, but then for the period that you're looking at, it was a sunsetting industry. And of course, I look up what actually goes into shipping and all that. I thought it's aluminum, but it's mostly steel that I found online. What then took off was not shipping when we closed all our shipyards, was shipping containers. But that was not aluminum either, that's also steel. So I wonder if there is something in there with that transition of steel to aluminum for certain aspects of these end markets and the retention of steel as the primary material in other markets that help differentiate the four little dragons type is what we call these places during that period that engineered this particular phenomenon in Hong Kong, when we somehow had this fluorescence of aluminum production facilities with Taiwanese technologies. Of course, borrowed heavily from America, the US, for production here in Asian markets. So I'm actually just trying to stretch our imagination a little bit by thinking about the entire food chain and trying to see what was actually going on.
Yeah. So on the end products, I think there's really two key markets. So one, like you said, is the domestic market, and you can see in the so things like windows and gates and doors. And just to give an example, in the Hong Kong public records, if I put in the keyword aluminum, what comes up is government purchasing for public buildings of aluminum windows and gates. There's hundreds of records of these things of which come up because they're building a building and they need to put in a purchase order, or they need to keep the record of this and say, purchase aluminum windows or purchase aluminum gates. So you seem to see that, and this begins in the 70s, late 60s, and really accelerating in the 70s and 80s. So it seems that in this domestic building boom that they begin using more and more aluminum for this. But for someone like Meyer, it begins because of the end product. So Meyer starts out just making these aluminum trinkets, ashtrays and flashlights and lanterns and things. And then it decides to build its own mill. So it's not purchasing the coil itself, that it's now going to manufacture the coil. It's going to manufacture the coil itself and create this vertical integration. So it continues expands its operation of making cookware. Utensils also become a big thing, not just for Meyer, but really for Hong Kong. Speaking of trade journals, there begins to be a number of trade journals for these cutlery and various cookware. Not so much for the domestic market. And they'll talk about that. Say, well, the Hong Kong people, they'll buy one pot. And they'll use chopsticks, so they're not going to buy aluminum forks and things. So there's not that much of a market for it, but there's a domestic market. But there's an export market for this: Japan, U.S., Southeast Asia, as well. The sense that I get, though, that it's largely this domestic market is the big thing for the aluminum coil stuff of what they're doing. And so someone like Meyer would be using a good portion of this for its own uses of producing this, but then it would also sell it to other manufacturers of end aluminum products who would be making the windows and whatnot. There, as far as I can gather, that there are only a few manufacturers in Taiwan of the coil itself, but there are a good number of these smaller manufacturers of aluminum products. Of the end products, again, cutlery, of which is a big thing. So Meyer, I think, is an interesting story in this because it has its own brand, but then it also begins producing things under other brand names, and this then enters into the retail revolution, of which begins in the U.S. around this time, with the rise of the big box stores like Walmart or Kmart or something, which are looking for cheaper manufacturing in East Asia and want products with their own name on it. And so they would turn to someone like Meyer and produce, whatever, a Kmart pot or pan for as cheap as they could, and then sell it in their own store. And this, we see this general trend happening throughout East Asia as this retail revolution accelerates in the U.S. and the box stores and begin finding manufacturers in East Asia. We see good research on this by like Gary Hamilton, and works on Taiwan, and then of course moving into China. But as the retail revolution accelerated in the U.S. and the box stores and turning to find cheaper productions and putting their own names on things. And so this is how I think like this story then begins to enter into this larger sort of global economic trends of what's going on. The shipbuilding, I'm not so sure. So the key products that Hong Kong firms are buying from Taiwan are the propellers and the engines, less so the hulls. There were some orders, like the Yamatai ferry would order whole boats from TMMC and its shipbuilding operation. But many of these smaller firms, and most of the requests coming in are for the engines and the propellers. And they would say, yeah, there's Hong Kong manufacturers, but we don't trust their quality. We want Taiwan quality for these things, especially the propellers. For some reason, these Hong Kong firms didn't like the propellers being manufactured in Hong Kong, and they wanted Taiwan quality propellers, which is kind of strange because Taiwan firms didn't like Taiwan quality stuff. They would only buy Japanese quality propellers and engines. And this is one of the reasons why then because Taiji Films develops this capacity to build these diesel engines, and then Taiwan firms are not buying them. So it begins selling them to Hong Kong and Southeast Asia because they're only buying the Japanese ones. But there's not much aluminum in there. So like you say, for the boats, it's mainly steel hulls. They're not doing aluminum hulls. Later they begin lining the methane tanks for the ships that are transporting methane to Hong Kong. So there's a U.S. firm which begins using in the 1960s or 1970s, begins using aluminum to line the hulls of its ships in order to transport methane, and it's using the Hong Kong aluminum in order to do this. Right, the CEO comes to Hong Kong and he has this press conference and makes this announcement about the methane, lining the methane hulls with aluminum for this. But that's the extent of the aluminum in the shipbuilding. So I mean, TMMC was kind of all over the place. I mean, producing the rolling mills for aluminum was just one small part of its operations. It had this whole shipbuilding operation as well, and then the diesel engines and things, which is separate from the aluminum.
Can I follow up with a very specific and odd question? Following up on the first question about whether the UK was out to lunch, I wonder if the search engines are using when you are doing archival searches, whether it makes a difference whether you use the word aluminum or, as a good old schoolboy here in Hong Kong and British Columbia, the aluminium. I wonder if that yields different results based on where you are and what you'll find A or B, or maybe AI is good enough to speak them both.
Aluminium.
Yes.
Okay.
I didn't know that.
This is a good.
It's not the same, isn't it? No.
No, because it's IUM, right?
Yes.
Rather than UM.
I say it differently and I spell it differently until I was in the US.
Okay. I will have to check now,
Yes.
John. Thank you for that.
But so fascinating. I really like this kind of micro approach and sort of supplementing the more macro narrative. And but there are two things. It seems you haven't really gone into the ownership of this company in Hong Kong. You said that you haven't got any reply from them.
That's right.
So is there any other? It seems quickly Google. It doesn't seem that they're putting up on their website, the company website, any history or anything. So
they have a short paragraph on their history. Their website's rather confusing. So they have like a front website which has no links and it says nothing, and then they have like this back website which I'm not quite sure how I found it, but I did so, and it has its history there. It has just a few paragraphs about its history.
So you have all the names of the owner, the founders?
No, I don't have any of that. So although I did find the name of the not of the owner, but of the guy who is the owner's son. Stanley Chung. Yeah. Stanley Chung? Who's in the US now and he owns a winery in Napa Valley.
So the same family that founded the other Meyer that make the kitchenware, the saucepans and all.
Yeah, that this is it.
Yeah. But actually, that seems to be they use another. They use aluminium. They didn't use the aluminium. They say kitchenware or kitchens.
Oh yeah. So Meyer.
So basically the same.
So Meyer. So initially it's Meyer Manufacturing or Meyer something or other. But then Meyer Aluminum is a subsidiary of that.
As a subsidiary of that.
Yes,
Specializing in the aluminum.
That's right. So so Meyer Aluminum is founded in the late 60s or 70s. In the late 60s as a subsidiary of the Meyer cutlery or cookware. Yeah.
Okay, so then you have names, right?
Yeah.
So you have names. So the father was Zhang Longci or something like that, Zhang Xilong or Zhang Zhang Longci. So that's the name of the father who founded it. In 1951.
You know this,
right? Yeah, this website has the name. I know the Chinese website. Have the father's name who founded it in 1951.
Yes.
And then in 1971, Stanley Zhang, the second generation took over, and then started to change the direction or whatever. So it seems that that's the narrative that they want to take. So the first generation, after 20 years. Now, if they build on that, my imagination is somewhat like number one in 1951. So first of all, maybe we would have to fit into this the first generation, the father, who he was. And if he set up a company, set up a factory in Hong Kong in 1951, that means likely it's different from China. Right? So in other words, he will probably have all the connection of people formerly in China with Guangdong or with the industrialists or maybe in Shanghai or in Guangzhou or somewhere, back to Taiwan. So in other words, the TMMC, the people that you're looking at, and he will actually come on the same sort. They're all refugees.
Yes.
After 1949. So that connection might continue. So that's number one. That's the one thing you really can trace. And then the other thing is about Stanley. Stanley was educated in America. So that's a one. So he would have all these connections. Work time, because we all know that Taiwan first, in the 1960s, a lot of Taiwanese people were sent to America, being educated in America, in particular in engineering. So I think he would come back with that sort of Taiwanese background in America, in the engineering schools in America. I don't know where he was educated in America, but probably you can find it.
So I read this.
Which is
Oregon.
In Oregon. Okay. So probably you will trace, and you can trace back the names of the people in the TMMC and how many of them were really trained in Oregon or maybe some kind of connection. I don't know. So that's one thing that I'm something interested in in the future we can trace on that. The other thing is really about the letters that I'm showing. I think it's quite fascinating because the first thing that came to my mind is why the Chinese industrialists in Hong Kong come writing to the industrialists in Taiwan would have written the letters in English. So of course, I mean, it's possible that because of the background, but then, I mean, even with that background, doesn't mean that they write in English, right? Mm. So unless it's a common practice or some sort of convention in this kind of communication. So I wonder whether when you see the archive in the Jinshi Shop about the TMMC, mostly those correspondence they have with Chinese sort of industrialists in maybe Southeast Asia or somewhere, but Chinese one, not the Chinese. All the correspondence were written in English.
Yeah, so this is the interesting thing is that up until in 1980 it begins to switch. They begin to do it in 1980s. It begins to switch to Chinese. But prior to that, in the 1970s, it's largely in English.
That's interesting.
So even with Japanese, of course, but yes, and the Hong Kong firms as well as Southeast Asia firms, it's mostly in English.
But both of them involved. It's not the Chinese engineers, right? The communication they're talking about, because this kind of business they're talking about decision makers. They're not just engineers, but actually these are the decision makers, managers.
That's right.
The people who can make decisions. Right?
Yeah.
So I suppose they're Chinese. They were Chinese.
They're all Chinese. Yeah.
So that's my question. Why those decision makers in TMMC would have written this kind of business correspondence in English in those, is that the case? And why later change to Chinese?
Yeah.
What's the implication of that?
Yeah. I'd like to hear what you think. My speculation is that that English is just like the common language of the common language of communication, and so that they write, and it's very simple vocabulary. There's only set phrases. We need such and such things, and so they just use English as this set mode. But then in the 1980s, I guess is maybe the next generation of Hong Kong people, then they feel more comfortable switching into Chinese. But another thing here is the technical terms for these things. So even when they're writing so the internal memos are in Chinese, in Taiji Gongsi. Their internal memos are in Chinese, but the technical terms for things that they all use the English name. So they'll call it a four high mill, right, with the stack, right? That they'll say, in Chinese, Meyer 公司今天定了4 high mill. Yeah.
They insert the English term in the Chinese.
Yes. But I don't know. I mean, it's another thing that they end up sending a lot of telexes back and forth. So there's the letters themselves, but then in the telex, I don't know how the telex work, but perhaps it's always very sort of simple and broken. But perhaps the English was the simplest way to send I never saw a telex in Chinese. Right, so it's like a telegram or something, right? It's like the fastest. I'm not sure how those things work, but I would speculate that it might be hard to do in Chinese.
Four digits, four digits for every time. You have to know all those digits.
Oh, yeah.
So it's really special. That's why I kind of feel like I think.
Like if it is, I don't know, whether it's similar to Telegram. I mean, telegrams for Chinese were more expensive than early 20th century, but because of the complications of converting, it's more expensive than the West. We're almost running out of time, but I do want to ask one quick final question. I want to know a bit more about Taiji Gongsi. I think that's just just really interesting. I think, can you tell us a bit more about, like, when you obviously mentioned how it was founded, but a bit more about how it was founded, and how do you connect that to kind of the developmental state that has been developing in the 30s and 40s in China, because it seems to be coming out of that tradition, I suppose. And of course, connected that, and that plays into what has already been asked, is like they developed this capacity, but we know that, in the 30s and also during the war, there was obviously a lot of technology transfer into China that went exactly into these kind of state-owned companies. And so I wonder whether, A, can you tell us a bit more about TMMC, and B, how do you situate it in relation to kind of 30s, 40s Chinese development of state and technology transfer that happened there?
Oh, yeah, no, interesting. So let me answer briefly the second part, which is not quite what you're asking, but it's the reverse. So what ends up happening before the KMT gets kicked out of China is that it's the transfer of the technology from Taiwan into China, so that they take over the Japanese stuff and they find the Japanese have more advanced machinery and capacities in Taiwan, and they begin shipping it to China. When they lose China, and then they begin shipping it back. But the interesting thing about TMMC is that it ends up doing a lot of its business, if you will, with China and Chinese firms before 49. What was it? I forget exactly what it's on, but it ends up liaison with many Chinese firms, especially the KMT firms, on mainland China before 49, and doing a lot of manufacturing for China at that time. And then, of course, once they lose China, there's this huge dip in its output and sales and everything, because it loses all that business with China. But now to come back to your first question about TMMC, yeah. So during the Japanese occupation on Taiwan, they developed these different companies in order to do various things around Taiwan, mainly related to the sugar industry and the shipbuilding. So one of the companies was the sugar mill itself on Taiwan, which was a huge business for Japan, and create manufacturing sugar and shipping it to Japan, and then a shop in order to service the machinery of the sugar mill. It wasn't all the machinery for the sugar milling came from Japan, so they didn't manufacture any of the equipment, but they would repair it on Taiwan in one of the what would become part of TMMC later in the machinery shop. And then they set up two shipyards. They were largely wasn't so much for manufacturing ships, but and they might have done some manufacturing, but largely for repairing these shipyards for ship repair. These Japanese companies. So when after the surrender and KMT takes over Taiwan, that they seize all these assets in these companies, and then they combine the companies into one company, which they call Taiji Gongsi, Taiwan Jixia Gongsi. And so they put all these operations under one roof, and then it becomes under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Economic Affairs as a state-run company. So then what is its mission? It's very sort of ambiguous to serve the state. So it had a certain autonomy in its own. The CEO, although it was state-run, although it was state-appointed, but then the president of Taiji Gongsi would still run it as an autonomous, making its own decision. But every now and then, it would get orders from the Ministry of Economic Affairs in order to facilitate certain missions or certain directives or things that the state wanted it to do. So, like I gave the example of the bicycles. Canning was another thing. The whole diesel engine thing was in order to service Taiwan's fishing industry. So they would build the boats because they kept buying the motors from Japan. So they thought, we'll make the motors ourselves. Of course, it didn't matter. The Taiwanese still didn't want to buy the motors from Taiji Gongsi. But what they ended up doing is stop making the small motors, much to the disappointment of Hong Kong firms. And they started making much bigger motors. And so you see all these letters coming in from Hong Kong firms saying they just want these tiny motors for fishing vessels or something. And Taiji Gongsi says, no, we don't make small motors anymore. So they started making these really big motors for the container ships. which they end up outfitting, which becomes like, Evergreen. You see today, like Evergreen, and what's the other one? Haiyuan, Yangming. All right, so there's the Evergreen and Yangming are the two big Taiwan shipping companies. So initially, these motors are the ones that are designed by Taiji Gongsa in order to propel these giant container ships. So they get directives like that to do. So it's this state-run company. If it gets very large, it employs thousands of people. It has shipyards in Geelong in the north and Kaohsiung in the south. These two shipyards, ship construction. It works very closely with other other state-run industries. There's Taiwan Aluminum, which it works very closely with for designing a lot of the aluminum manufacturing stuff. And then there's the machine development. So there's a research organization which, in order to develop machine tools, things which did a lot of the blueprints. So you have a Hong Kong firm, like Meyer said, well, we want a certain kind of mill. They would send that to the machine development center, drop the blueprints, and then Taiji Gongsa would manufacture it for them. So with the privatization push in the 80s and 90s, it gets privatized, but it's by that time in the 90s, it's not very profitable. It's doing like too many things. It doesn't have like one specialty. It's kind of all over the place. So no one wants to buy it. So they reduce the price. They spin off some of the things. It gets bought out in various parts and then disappears. So it's like in 96, it no longer exists.
Right. Yeah. I think, as I said, we've already run out of time. So what remains for me to do is, thank you very much for giving us such a wonderful talk, and to all of you for coming, both online and in person. So thank you very much.